This time the story is about the Village of the Dead. The crazy village, Ricky said, his eyes darting here and there as if the event was seared into his memory. Crazy how? I asked, curious. How not crazy? Every day there are always people who die. If no one dies, they say it will invite disaster. Our conversation continued and made me even more curious until my eyes were distracted when a black Honda RC motorcycle had just stopped. Evan, a figure I also knew intimately, came, sat down and ordered coffee. Van, please tell me the story of you and I when we strayed into a village called the Dead, Ricky said. Evan's calm face suddenly changed, indicating displeasure, and I could clearly see the look of horror on his face. Just remember it, forget it. Hearing that, I immediately begged him to tell me. At first, Evan still refused to tell me, but I persuaded him by saying I would pay for the coffee he ordered earlier. Then I saw Ricky pointing at something and said, "You know that area over there, north of the mountain?" I nodded. That's where the village is, and this is where the story begins. At that time, Ricky had just been appointed as the head of the student nature lovers for the 2011 to 2012 period at one of the most famous universities in the city. Being chairman in the 6th semester was not wise, especially when there was an agenda that in July there would be a project to climb the top of Mount Mahamuru, where there would be 4 universities with their nature lover students. Here, Ricky made an impromptu event to prepare their team's ability in July, but none of the members were able to because it coincided with the midterm examination. Due to the lack of preparation, Ricky took the initiative to continue his agenda, even if he had to be alone. Evan, the previous head of the student nature lovers, finally joined in to maintain the good name of their university, and this is where they found a place that felt suitable. Alastenga is one of the places to train stamina because of the uphill terrain, and also the best place to get a moment where the temperature in this place is like the temperature at the top of Mahamuru. Before Ricky and Evan knew what was waiting for them there. Preparations had been made 1 week earlier, starting from permission to climb as well as combing the place that would be the destination of this climb. Even though the path that Ricky and Evan would go to was not an official climbing route, but Ricky still convinced Evan. The 6-hour journey seemed short, especially in the late afternoon. Ricky was still checking everything. Their car stopped at a post that was familiar to them. Surprisingly, no one was on guard that night. Although it is not an official hiking trail, it is a trail that is often crowded with visitors because it is one of the famous tourist attractions. Waiting, that's what Ricky did, because after all, reports are important, especially to prevent unwanted things. 2 hours passed and still no one appeared, which made Evan nervous. "It's like this, Rick. Just leave our IDs here and write a message that we've been waiting here for a long time. Besides, we don't know when the officer will come," said Evan. Indecisive. That's what Ricky was thinking. Not once or twice did this happen, but it was one thing that Ricky remembered. Things like this were usually accompanied by bad events in the next step, but Evan was right. No one knew when the officer would return. Ricky and Evan finally desperately stepped into the forest. The clock had already struck 8 p.m. It shouldn't have been that dark, especially since the trail was still not too far from the first post. But it was different. The trail was darker than usual. Stranger still, there wasn't a single night animal around. The terrain was indeed uphill like a hill path that when traced higher, but still can be traveled at a leisurely pace. Evan said, "My grandmother said that if there's no sound, there's usually a ghost." "Huss, watch your mouth. It's not good to say that," said Ricky. There was something that made Ricky feel uneasy walking behind Evan. There should be no one behind him, but his bulukuduk had been standing for a while. It was not the first time Ricky felt this. As long as he climbed mountains and entered forests like this, bulukuduk or neck crawling had become his daily food. But the feeling this time was different, as if this one was much more intimidating. But Evan didn't feel anything. Seeing Evan pave the way with his machete in hand at least gave Ricky some peace of mind until he heard strange noises. Ricky stopped, followed by Evan. "Rick, Rick!" he called. Evan came closer and looked at Ricky. "What? Can't you hear a chicken?" Evan paused, trying to hear what Ricky had heard. However, Evan emphasized that there was no sound except for the wind blowing through the leaves. "Nothing," Evan said. They looked at each other for a split second, then moved on quickly. There are things that should not be said or heard, one of which is the sound of chickens. Hearing the sound of a chicken is like a sign of bad luck for whoever hears it, especially in this place. Ricky and Evan were thinking the same thing. Kuntilanak. Although the sentence was not spoken, but they both understood each other. The question was, the sound of the chicken that Ricky heard and Evan didn't, confirmed it. One of them had been targeted all along. The heartbeat and the sound of panting breath confirmed that they had walked further. Thinking that they were safe, it was Evan who later said, "Damn, the smell of Sembuho Bungan." The two of them looked at each other. Sure enough, the sound of chickens, the smell of flowers, and then the figure behind the bushes began to appear. Evan was the first to know, but the desire to call Ricky, who had permission to urinate, aroused great curiosity. Evan peered at the strange figure. A tall figure about Evan's height, he stood under a shady tree just standing there, wearing a shirt that looked like a very white cloth in the darkness of the forest. Evan continued to look, his gaze fixed on the stranger's head, which had been moving left and right. After a while, then Evan understood why his head was moving, because right on his neck, apparently holding the weight of his head, what else his neck was broken. At that moment, Evan realized that he had seen a demon, Kuntilanak, that he often heard about in the forest. Generally, it is often heard that the inhabitants or watchers in the forest are victims of accidents or unusual disasters. Now that he had seen them with his own eyes, Evan finally knew that they were real. Ricky was back. They continued their journey. Their own plan was to have already covered half of the hiking trail, which according to Ricky, when viewed from the length of time they walked, was not far away. Evan was more often silent, which made Ricky curious. Cigarette smoke tried to break the ice, but Evan still chose to remain silent. Occasionally, he stole a glance at the back where there was clearly no one but Ricky. "What's wrong, Van?" "Nothing, Rick." Ricky knew Evan was lying. It was only when he reached the field, which meant that the second post or the place used for roasting animals was near, that Evan opened his voice. "There was a Kuntilanak demon earlier, Rick." Shocked, but Ricky didn't try to respond. He just looked at Evan more pale. A sip of water from the bottle at least calmed Evan down, after he had calmed down enough to tell the story of how he saw the creature. Ricky was now in charge. This is where the weirdness happened. The post that should have been not far from the field was nowhere to be seen. Almost 2 hours, Rick and Evan just circled in that area. This made them finally think of staying there. Regardless of what they experienced in the mini, they chose to surrender. Until finally there was the sound of very heavy footsteps that made them wake up and follow the footsteps that were heard. There, Evan and Ricky saw it. People were walking in rows, as if there was something they were doing, until Evan and Ricky's eyes fell on the front row, where they realized there were many graves of the dead. Why are these people burying bodies at night like this? At least that's what Ricky and Evan thought. Until they realized, how could there be a funeral in the middle of the forest? The oddity had actually been felt from the beginning of entering the forest. Ricky and Evan were just looking at the group further and further away, until finally their presence completely disappeared in the darkness of the forest. In the midst of these mixed feelings, Ricky suddenly complained of pain. Actually, they had been walking through the tough terrain. Ricky's crotch was painful, but he tried to hold it. The peak was when Evan invited him to continue. Suddenly, Ricky complained that he could not continue. He told Evan about his condition, and when he checked what happened, Ricky didn't know what to say to Evan about his condition. "How is it, Rick? Can you continue or not?" Ricky called Evan, asking him to come closer while telling him his complaint. And when he showed him his current condition, Evan could only stare in disbelief at what he saw. "Damn it, what is this? What's wrong with you?" asked Evan, as his eyes focused on the oddity. "Don't know, Van," said Ricky. Seeing Ricky's condition like that, Evan finally told Ricky to lean against the tree, his mind focused on the group that had just passed by. Genie or not, Evan had to call them so that Ricky could be helped immediately. Not only that, this was the first time Evan had faced something like this. How could things like this happen? Even though they did not forget to pray that everything would be smooth. But how come Ricky's thesis was enlarged like that? The size of his own was almost the same as a clenched fist. Evan only thought one thing. The mountain genie must have done it. Evan left Ricky alone. He ran through the bushes towards the group that had disappeared into the darkness. There was something strange, and whether Ricky heard it or not, but Evan was sure, earlier when they peeked at the group, he heard the sound of gamelan. That's what made Evan dare not speak, because he focused on hearing the strains of the gamelan being hit. Not only that, the facial expressions of the procession did not show any sad or sympathetic faces. On the contrary, the faces were happy as if they were having a party. Then the manyat coffin that was carried looked strange. Usually it was covered with a dark green cloth, but what Evan and Ricky saw was that the manyat coffin was covered with a black cloth, complete with jasmine flowers knitted as accompaniment. These things were Evan's benchmark. Hopefully he could still hear the gamelan music, and hopefully they were human. Running for about 10 minutes and getting farther and farther away from Ricky, who was still in pain, Evan realized that the group had disappeared, leaving a question mark. How could they walk leisurely by carrying the coffin of manyat with this up and down terrain? Desperate, Evan finally returned to where Ricky was. He hoped to finish soon and get out of this wilderness area. When he returned, Evan was surprised to find that Ricky was not alone in front of him. There was an old woman on his back carrying firewood. Seen from afar, Ricky seemed to be chatting with the grandmother, making Evan wonder, hesitate, then get closer. That's when it was discovered that the old lady was a local. She lived in a village not far from where they were. The old lady offered them a place to stay and told them that what happened to Ricky was the result of Weltuk. Huh, what's that? Evan asked. That's where the grandmother, who claimed to be able to heal Ricky, told him that Weltuk was a river-dwelling demon who was angry with Ricky because accidentally Ricky had urinated on him. As a result, Ricky was hit in his pubic area, initially hesitant and worried when the old lady offered Evan and Ricky to follow her to the village where she lived. But because it was a real emergency, Evan finally agreed. Ricky was carried with such conditions. During the trip, the grandmother told him many things, one of which said, "Excuse me if you want to relieve yourself or whatever." The fact that they were invisible didn't mean they didn't exist, even if they only asked permission in a whispered voice they could hear, including the wangle, who was now following Evan. Shocked, Evan then asked with a frightened face, "What's a wangle?" The grandmother stopped, looking far back, where she pointed at something. "It's a female demon who died in an accident, broke her neck, and has been following you. What do you smell?" Evan said, "Sembujo." The grandmother nodded. "It's okay if it's Sembujo, if it's carrion flowers. Then it's dangerous." "Then how long will I be followed?" Evan said. "Just leave it alone. It will go by itself," said the grandmother. Sure enough, there was a village ahead, but it wasn't very big. The houses were made of woven bamboo, very different from the condition of houses today, which are built with bricks and cement. Right at the far corner of the house, the roof was made of twigs and covered with dried coconut leaves. Then the grandmother invited us to enter. "Put your friend to bed first," she said. She went inside while Evan and Ricky stayed on the porch, where there was a big bench for Ricky to lie down on. Evan was still thinking. Just because he peed without asking permission, it could be like this. Evan looked here and there, his gaze focused from the house at the end to the end. There were only 13 houses here, and before he had never been in this area, there was a village. At midnight like this, the village looked quiet, and it was enough to make Evan and Ricky scared. Not long after, the grandmother came out while carrying a glass. "Drink this. Then when you drink it, face south so that the disease will go south, son," said the grandmother. After finishing drinking it, Ricky and Evan were told to go inside the house and not to come out so that the disaster could go away. Evan didn't understand what the grandmother meant when she said balasado, but Evan said yes to the offer. This time they believed that the grandmother who helped them might indeed be human. Inside the house, it was exactly as Evan had imagined. A country house that really looked like the countryside. There was no electricity, and even the appliances were all really old-fashioned. Ricky was already fast asleep after being invited to rest, when Evan was surprised to hear the sound of the gamelan. Now Evan understood. Maybe it was a group of people from this village. But why did the gamelan music seem so close? The grandmother went to the door and opened it. In front of her was a small child, her face pale and her expression unpleasant. The more he looked at her, the more uneasy Evan's heart became. The grandmother seemed to be chatting for a long time. Evan caught a glimpse of broken sentences. The only words Evan heard were turn, death, brother, knowledge. After that, the door was closed. The grandmother went back in and took a cloth, then covered her head with it. There, Evan Pooh asked. Where are you going? That's when the grandmother offered Evan whether he wanted to go or not. The offer initially made Evan hesitate because he had to look after Ricky, but there was a great desire that made him curious, especially when he saw the pale boy's face, like something was wrong. Evan chose to follow the grandmother. Apparently, Evan was taken to a house, in front of which many people were waiting. He was right. There was a gamelan playing among the crowd. Not long after, Evan's gaze went to the door of the house. 4 middle-aged men came out. They lifted the coffin and made Evan uncomfortable. In his mind, he wondered, instead of having a funeral procession, why was there a funeral again? That's where the grandmother led. She walked in the front row. Since they were already halfway there, Evan was forced to follow. Along the ups and downs of the journey, the faces showed expressions of happiness. It was odd things like that that made Evan unable to stop thinking, but he tried to restrain himself. Apparently, the one who was going to be crushed tonight was the little boy who had been standing at the door of the grandmother's house. That son of a bitch, Evan said to himself. As if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, the more he looked, the more his face matched exactly what Evan saw. There was no way he could have seen it wrong. I, who heard Evan's story, looked confused. What does that mean? The child in the grave is exactly the same as the child who knocked on the grandmother's door. Evan took a drag on his cigarette, then said yes. No way, I said. Evan and Ricky Pugh continued their story. Evan couldn't help but watch the funeral procession. In the middle of the funeral, Evan noticed a strange movement, where everyone seemed to be dancing, some singing to the accompaniment of gamelan sounds. What Evan couldn't understand was that the boy was buried with his eyes still wide open. I couldn't tell whether I wanted to laugh or be scared by Evan's story. What does that mean? Is the child actually dead or not? Evan remained silent for a long time. Then Ricky interrupted Evan's story. Silence. Quiet. Silence. At least that's what Ricky felt. He woke up even though his eyes still felt sleepy. He looked here and there. He just remembered he had just fallen asleep on the bed of someone's house, an old man who offered his house. Ricky rushed to find Evan, but he didn't find him. With a confused and curious look, he wondered where everyone had gone. Ricky tried calling Evan, but there was no answer, and neither was the old woman. Still in a daze, he looked at his condition. The size of his penis was not normal, but much better than a moment ago. Ricky stayed silent for a while. He saw that the ceiling above the house was still dark. He said to himself, "This means that one night has not passed." Ricky went back into the house that looked more like a hut, until he felt curious about the old woman's inner room. Ricky slowly approached. Inside the house, Ricky smelled a familiar smell. Apparently, it was the smell of siri leaves used by the old woman. Ricky tried to examine the house. His curiosity was so great. His eyes were busy watching this and that until he saw a box with a carved Majapala, a Javanese carving. Ricky approached slowly. Apparently, the box was not locked. Ricky freely lifted it, but Ricky suddenly felt bad. The smell that was initially dominated by the smell of betel leaves suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a smell like burnt potatoes or cassava. Everyone knows what that smell is. Usually when you smell something like that, it means that not far from where you are standing, there is a famous spirit watching you, or what is called a pokong. However, Ricky didn't know that yet, so he was desperate to open the box. When the box opened, Ricky stared in surprise because all he saw was a pile of white clothes piled up just like that. When Ricky wanted to close the box, he suddenly felt suspicious of the pile of clothes. He took one of the clothes, and when the clothes were taken, he felt carefully until he was sure and looked at the fear of the clothes. Apparently, it was a shroud that had been tied in such a way as to form a smapple to wrap the corpse. Ricky suddenly threw the clothes away. Suddenly, as Ricky prepared to leave the place, his eyes were shocked to see a figure standing right in front of him. His eyes were black, and his form was terrifying. Now there was a pokong figure standing right in front of him. He wanted to run away immediately, but his legs felt heavy and he couldn't move them, while the Pocong was still standing looking at him. If there was one request that Ricky could ask for, maybe he would ask to fall unconscious. It was an event he could never forget. Finally, Ricky heard her voice. Softly but making the crowd stand up, the Pocong said, "Tali Pocong, Tali Pocong." Ricky was still immobilized, fear really hardening his nerves, until the sound of the door slamming made him even more afraid and panicked. He saw that she had returned with a very angry face and was cursing. He didn't know what had happened. He saw her grab the end of the Pocong's shroud, then drag it and throw it right in the back garden of the hut. The incident that had just happened left Ricky speechless. The grandmother looked at Ricky with a cold gaze as she said, "If you don't know anything, don't just touch anything, child. Your life could be lost." That sentence is still on Ricky's mind even now. Evan just realized that he hadn't seen his grandmother all this time, even though he had come because he was invited by his grandmother, in addition to his curiosity about why burying someone had to be at night like this. And this is where Evan was shocked. Why hasn't the rope been opened yet? However, no one listened to Evan. They continued to cover the grave hole with soil. Evan felt a bad feeling. "Crazy village," said Evan. Evan left the place immediately. Arriving at the grandmother's house, Evan saw Ricky. They stared at each other. Here they were suspicious. This village may not be a human village, but there is something bigger than that. There was a mystery hidden in this village. In the midst of the confusion, the grandmother's footsteps surprised them. Her face that had hardened when she saw Ricky had now changed to its usual state, just like the first time they met her. "Knock. The room has been prepared," she said. Inevitably, they entered a room. There was nothing interesting other than a bed with a woven mat as a base. But they agreed, the strangeness of all these events seemed to lead to something. However, no one dared to draw conclusions. Just as they were about to rest, they heard a familiar voice. The sound was boisterous but very thin, as if from a distant place. It was the sound of chickens that they had heard before. Evan was the first to wake up. He looked around to confirm something, until finally Evan woke up Ricky. He just realized Ricky's face looked pale, as if he was hiding something. "Rick, do you hear the chicken?" Ricky was still silent, trying to digest everything Evan said, until finally he said, "Van, don't you believe in Pocong?" That sentence reminded Evan of the events he had just experienced, his eyes staring intently at Ricky. He didn't know where to start. "I've heard it said that if you hear the sound of chickens, there's a Pocong nearby." "Rick!" Evan finally told him what happened to him. "Rick, this village is not right. Let's just go. Your penis is better, right?" Hearing that, Ricky then also said, "Van, it looks like that old lady." Before he could finish his sentence, Ricky's eyes suddenly looked up at the window of the room where he saw a face peeking out. "Van, let's just get out of here." "What's wrong?" said Evan. "At the window! At the window!" Ricky pointed at the window. "In the window is the face of the old lady." Shocked, Evan immediately packed all his belongings and Ricky followed suit. They rushed out of the house, but just as they opened the door to the room, in front of them was the grandmother standing with her face looking at Ricky and Evan in turn. "Where are you going?" said the grandmother. Ricky was the first to come forward and said, "I'm sorry, we're going home." "Where are you going?" "To my own house, Grandma." The grandmother stood at first, but slowly her body bent down and looked at them with the most terrifying smile Ricky and Evan had ever seen in their lives. "Is your illness cured, child?" asked the grandmother. Ricky was silent for a long time. Then Evan came forward to ask, "Who are you really?" Just then, the ugly smile turned into a laugh that made Evan and Ricky shiver with fear. Their hair stood up, and their hearts beat faster. "The village of the life taker," said the old woman. She limped over to the two of them, who were terrified. "Whoever enters this village will never leave. Just obey my word," said the grandmother. In the midst of the confusion, the sound of a chicken was heard more and more often. "Do you hear that chicken? Do you know what that means?" Evan and Ricky still kept their distance from the grandmother while saying Pocong. After saying that, it was as if something made Evan and Ricky feel bad. Sure enough, there was no wind, no rain, and suddenly there was the sound of a door slamming very loudly, and followed by the sound of pounding on all sides of the house. Then the grandmother laughed even louder. Ricky and Evan's guts were pushed to the point of frustration because there was nothing they could do, as if this incident was just a dream. The voices signaled one thing: there must be something around the house. The grandmother, who was initially bent over, then began to fall, lying on the ground with her eyes glaring at Ricky and Evan. She started crawling. Her legs seemed paralyzed. She crawled using only her hands, with lips that were mumbling with no idea what she was saying. She kept getting closer. Ricky began to read prayers, asking that anyone could help her. On the other hand, Evan was just silent while saying to himself, "Bastard! Bastard!" It was then that a familiar scent was smelled that seemed to awaken Evan and Ricky. The scent was the scent of Sembujo. The scent was getting more and more pungent. The crowded sound that had been discouraging Evan and Ricky slowly disappeared. "There's a van door at the back," Ricky shouted. They rushed over, and the grandmother was still trying to catch up. The smell of Sembujo was still very strong. Strangely, only Evan smelled it. "Come with me, Rick." Whether pinched or not, Evan felt that this scent was getting the better of him. Sure enough, their steps slowly made their way to the forest floor. The trees that had been a sign of their journey now began to be traced. Evan assured Ricky that the village was inhabited by the corpses of the dead. The question was, why did the corpses have to be buried again? Van's shroud, is there any connection? Evan looked confused. In the box in the kitchen, there are many shrouds. Evan and Ricky were still thinking until they realized where they were standing. They were not alone anymore. From behind the tree, there were many pairs of eyes watching, and after paying attention again, it was a Pokong figure. Not just one Pokong, but there were many Pokong. Ricky and Evan were stunned into silence. Ricky faintly heard the sound of "Tali Pokong! Tali Pokong!" "Did you hear something, Van?" "Hear what?" said Evan. "A leash." After hearing that, Evan understood. "Graveyard. Graveyard. Rick. The Pokong rope on the corpse hasn't been opened yet." They ran, letting the Pokongs follow. To their horror, the Pokongs flew above them. "Where is the grave?" Ricky asked. "Over there." In the middle of the dark forest, Ricky and Evan did not stop running. After all, what normal human being wouldn't be terrified of being followed by almost a dozen or more shrouds flying left and right, while hearing them say Tali Pokong along the way? After going through thousands of bushes and up and down on uphill ground, Evan pointed to a hut. Evan knew that the hut marked the twin graves. Why is it called twin graves? Apparently there are two cemeteries that are parallel and only separated by bamboo. Here another oddity occurred. The Pokong that had been flying above them was no longer visible. Even so, the sound of chickens that had sounded very far away now sounded closer, so close that Evan assumed that the sound of the chicken came from this cemetery. The problem was, where were the chickens? It was different with Ricky. Now he smelled it. The aroma of Sembujo that only Evan could smell was now also in Ricky's nose. "It smells good," Ricky said while looking here and there, until Evan pointed at something, the mound of earth where Evan had seen it. As it got closer, the sound of chickens became clearer. And sure enough, from afar, someone was scratching the ground, and the surroundings were surrounded by black chickens. "Ayam Chemini," said Evan. They watched from afar what the stranger was doing. "Damn," Evan shouted when the man saw him. "Well, that's the old lady," Evan said. Evan immediately ran away, leaving Ricky, who just realized what Evan said. The grandmother immediately chased them. In the midst of the panic, the mysterious Sembujo scent wafted back, stronger, and they could both smell it very clearly. Son of a bitch! What's wrong with this forest? Either out of desperation or something, they approached the source of the Sembujo scent, even though they both knew that it was the scent of Wangle or demons. However, at least the scent did lead them to a familiar path. Ricky, who was following Evan from behind, only heard a flurry of roaring sounds, loud as a tiger. Regardless of anything and everything, they suddenly arrived at the place they had been looking for all this time. The second post, where they could see the iron fence where the animal sanctuary operated. In a cold sweat they approached. There was a light source inside. They banged on the door and out came a middle-aged man looking at them suspiciously. "You left your ID cards at post 1? They nodded. Just then the officer said, "Idiot! If you want to go up to the summit, why go this way? You should go up that way. The officer then explained that they had been missing for 2 days in the forest. The officer seemed very angry. Evan and Ricky and just silent, resigned, confused, do not know what to say. After a while, the sound of a motorcycle approaching and entering the post was a man who was maybe 10 years older than Evan and Ricky. He was only wearing a t-shirt with a cloth wrapped around his body. His face was no less fierce. He looked at Evan and Ricky. The first sentence he said was not angry like the post 2 guard, but he just asked something that made Evan and Ricky silent for a long time. "Are you two still alive?" He drank the coffee at the table, then sat cross-legged in front of them. "Tell me already, where have you been for the past 2 days?" "Sir," Ricky said, "is there a village around here?" The 2 guards looked at each other. "There is," the post guard replied. The post guard was silent for a long time. While the younger guard looked confused while whispering, he asked, "Where is the village, sir?" "There are many villas here," said the younger guard. While smoking a cigarette, the father's face looked tense. "Is it true that you two were the only ones hiking here?" Evan and Ricky nodded simultaneously. "Thank God," the man said. "In the past, many people have seen that there is a place called the 1,000 Doors, a sacred tree that is said to have a village inside it. This village is called the Village of the Dead." A puff of smoke made everyone in the room quietly listen. Their faces all looked tense. The problem is that no one knows where the tree is. Luckily, you guys didn't get stuck in this village with an odd number of people. If that happens, usually only one can't go home. Evan and Ricky looked at each other. "Now let me ask you, what are you feeling right now?" Here at first, Ricky was confused, whether he should tell about his body condition or not. Finally, with Evan's help, Ricky showed his pubic area. Seeing this, the father was silent, seemingly not surprised at all, as if he had never seen this before. The father told Ricky to sleep on his back while his toes were pulled one by one. For about half an hour, the man massaged Ricky's feet. Miraculously, his enlarged penis slowly returned to normal. "Don't pee all over the place tomorrow." After the conversation, Evan and Ricky said goodbye to go home. When dawn began to break, Ricky was the first to leave. On the other hand, Evan returned to meet the father to ask questions with a curious face. "Sir, I want to ask once again. There was an old woman who had chased the two of us. Who was it?" The father's face looked thoughtful, then said, "Sartia." "What? Sarti?" Evan said. "You know, if Po Kong can actually be bound by black magic, now Sarti is just a title. Po Kong can be sent to harm anyone, can be used to disrupt people's business. Well, this village is owned by the old woman." "The old woman is human, sir." The man was silent and shook his head. He couldn't take this any further. Now from this information, Evan deduced that the way to tie a Po Kong was by holding the rope. Now the question is, how many Po Kong have been tied up, and why the existence of this village still appears? Actually, stories about Po Kong banishment are not new. There are many stories about Po Kong banishment, ranging from being a salesperson to a bearer of bad luck or a bearer of bad luck for people who are not liked. Whatever it is, perhaps the end of this story is related to this village. The important point here is, far from this EHAT sense, indeed supernatural things often hide their own mysteries. That night, after finishing listening to the story, one thing I learned, the experience that happened to Evan and Ricky really made me have to always be vigilant wherever we are. As the saying goes, where the earth is, there the sky is.